Since our ancestors first stood on two legs, we've looked up at the universe with wonder. And we've been lighting up the night sky since the Chinese first invented rockets, some 2,000 years ago. In the early 1900s, American inventor Robert Goddard brought space and rockets together and launched a new era in human history.
Sometimes we don't really understand what doing something for the first time really means. Goddard launched the first liquid fuel rocket. That's equal in significance to the future of the space age as what the Wright brothers did for flight.
Without him, it wouldn't be possible for me and my friends who are current astronauts and the astronauts that came before us and all the astronauts in the future to take their ride into space.
Born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1882, Robert Goddard grew up at a time when spaceflight was only a dream, or fiction in the latest novels of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Young Robert was a huge fan.
He read From the Earth to the Moon, and then H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. And this just started him on this fantasy trip that never let go of him for the rest of his life.
Both Jules Verne and H.G. Wells thought long and hard about the scientific aspects of traveling to other places. And they realized that you couldn't just go to sleep and wake up in another location. In the case of Jules Verne, his answer was that you shoot him out of a cannon.
Cannons wouldn't work, as Goddard later realized. But at the turn of the century, at age 17, he was just one of many readers around the world swept up by the two writers' visions of space. As he began his chores on October 19, 1899, he already had stars in his eyes.
Goddard's father sent him out to trim a cherry tree in the backyard. And he seems to have had a mystical vision about inventing some kind of a machine that would make it possible to travel from the Earth to other worlds.
And it changed his life. He said he came down from that tree and decided that this was what he was going to make his life's work. And for the rest of his life, literally, he pursued this objective of how do we get off this planet? How do we reach the moon?
Goddard called October 19th Anniversary Day and celebrated it yearly for the rest of his life. Boundless optimism would match his single-minded dedication to space travel. As high school valedictorian, he claimed, "The dream of yesterday is the hope of today, and the reality of tomorrow." Goddard entered college near home in 1904. 1 year after the Wright brothers flew the world's first airplane. There, he began to methodically turn his dreams and hopes of spaceflight into reality. His first challenge was the greatest, and the most basic: getting off the ground.
Escaping Earth's gravity is the problem we have. The space station flies about 250 miles above the Earth. And that's pretty much a trip from Boston to New York, which you can do pretty quickly. You can get in your car or bus, train, whatever you want to do, airplanes real quick, and you can get there relatively quickly and easily. But to do that straight up to space, those 250 miles become very difficult to get to. And then when you consider going to the moon, which is now 250,000 miles away, that's even harder.
Robert Goddard was the first person who actually seriously thought about the use of rockets to reach another place, to go to the moon or to go to Mars or some other location.
Okay, what is a rocket? Basically, an explosion contained in a tube that's open at one end. If you put the open end down and the closed end up, then this explosion should make it go up, right? If you continuously keep the explosion going, then you can go who knows how far until your fuel runs out.
Rockets have been around for centuries, lighting up celebrations and frightening enemies in battle. But their explosive power traditionally came from gunpowder, a solid fuel.
One of the things that Goddard realized was that solid fuels did not give you enough thrust to escape the Earth's gravity. So liquids is where he went. And very quickly he decided that you could, with the proper chemical reactions, create the thrusts necessary to go into orbit, ultimately go to the moon.
Goddard realized that what he was onto, if he could work out the mechanics, there was no limit. Literally no limit.
It was 1910. Working quietly, alone, on paper, Goddard took the first giant step toward space travel. Outside Goddard's window, Model Ts chugged along at 25 miles per hour. Inside, he was perfecting a liquid fuel formula to make a rocket fly 25,000 miles per hour, the velocity needed to leave Earth behind. Armed with visions of interplanetary rockets and a teaching position at Princeton University, the young physicist was ready for his next challenge. It came from left field. In 1913, at Princeton, Goddard contracted tuberculosis. Doctors predicted he had only weeks to live. He returned home to die.
He established a pattern of proving the impossible is possible. He fired the nurse that his family had hired for him, wrapped himself up in a ton of blankets, and spent the rest of the Massachusetts winter living and sleeping on the porch. And if you've been to that part of the country, you know what that was. He got well.
Goddard survived thanks to his self-reliant stubbornness, a quality that would prove to be a strength and a weakness. His lungs were permanently damaged, but that didn't stop Goddard from smoking cigars again, or resuming his work. Hired by nearby Clark College, he tried to balance teaching and research. Research won by a long shot. Goddard's breakthrough liquid fuel rocket equation was just the beginning. Space was airless, an endless vacuum. Could rockets really fly in that vast nothingness?
There were a lot of people in the first part of the 20th century and earlier who believed that for any sort of rocket to actually work, it had to push against something. And in that context, if you're in space where there is nothing to push against, it's a vacuum, there was a belief that it wouldn't work at all. It would just sit there and not do anything.
Goddard, at the beginning of 1914 and 15, set up a series of increasingly elaborate experiments to prove that a rocket would provide thrust in a vacuum. We found out it was more efficient because it didn't have the drag from the air.
With his proof that rockets could fly through space, in theory, he was finally ready to demonstrate, in fact. But to build rockets, he needed money. He put all his research together into one scientific paper, sent it to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and asked for support. The Smithsonian not only said yes, in 1919 it published his paper, titled A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. Goddard's paper changed everything.
In it, he laid out how rockets, especially liquid-propelled rockets, would be able to achieve the goal of reaching the moon.
A Smithsonian press release tipped reporters about a possible rocket to the moon, and they ran with it. The public went wild. People thought Goddard already had a moon rocket in his workshop, ready for countdown. Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart and its highest-paid movie star, asked to send a message to the moon on Goddard's rocket. But along with believers were non-believers. They unintentionally became Goddard's biggest promoters.
What happened was in 1920, the New York Times published an editorial essentially lambasting Goddard for this particular idea. They referred to him as the Moon Man, criticized him, made fun of him, and suggested that this would not go anywhere. That editorial then made its way into other newspapers, literally around the world. And it gave attention to a method of reaching extreme altitudes that it would not have got on its own.
Goddard decided to use the spotlight, however negative. He made a public appeal for at least $50,000 to build rockets. He got a few thousand from the Smithsonian. Undiscouraged, Goddard went to work in a tiny tool shed on the Clark campus.
Building the rocket was the problem. It's an extremely challenging technical area that nobody had ever worked in before. It goes beyond science. It's just trial and error. Simple as that. Simple, but so complicated.
Each solution led to a new problem. Years went by, and Goddard kept tinkering, but the Smithsonian wanted results. Liquid fuel was a huge stumbling block.
There are so many technical complications to introducing something that's almost 400 degrees below zero into a metal container and then setting a match to it and having it going up to 1,500 to 3,000 degrees above zero in almost an instant.
Goddard's ideal fuel mixture was liquid hydrogen and oxygen. But liquid hydrogen, a volatile explosive, was 2 decades away from being safely produced. Goddard and an assistant could get their hands on liquid oxygen. Mixed with kerosene, it just might work. In early 1926, they gave it a try.
And they had a couple of false starts. But sure enough, on March 16th, and a cold, snowy day on his Aunt Effie's truck farm near Auburn, Massachusetts, they got it to go. It didn't look like much. It only went up about 40 feet and looped around because it burnt part of its nozzle off and hit the ground and skidded and sputtered, and that was the end of it. But nothing like that had ever happened on Earth before. A liquid fuel rocket flew.
There to record the event was Goddard's bride, Esther.
She was his camera person, and she was using a little wind-up camera, which only had a few seconds of capability before you had to rewind it. And they lit the rocket. The camera started. It didn't launch when it was supposed to, and by the time that it did launch, the wind had gone down, and she was in the process of rewinding it when it took off.
Esther's techniques would show improvements sooner than her husband's rockets. Over the next 4 years, Goddard and a few workmen built, launched, examined, and rebuilt rocket after rocket. Along the way, they improved one of Goddard's major innovations, the nozzle.
He got the idea of putting a nozzle on the end of the rocket motor, that open end where the blast comes out. Put a nozzle that constricts the blast and then opens it up. So you're getting more bang for the buck. Now, you see the space shuttle take off today. The nozzles are those 3 great big black bells at the bottom where the fire comes out. That seems just common sense, but no. Somebody had to think of it first, and Goddard was the one.
Not only a brilliant inventor, Goddard was savvy enough to protect his work. He would eventually claim over 200 patents. But some of his ideas were too advanced for the time, or his own engineering skills. One crucial Goddard patent that others perfected later was staging.
Weight is a problem. So if you have a lot of weight, I'm a big astronaut, so I'm very sensitive to the weight thing. But the more weight you have on board, the harder it is to get your rocket to space. By staging, what you're doing is you have different stages. And once you've burned out the first stage, the fuel is gone, throw the thing away, get rid of that weight. So it makes it easier for the rest of the rocket to keep going.
Goddard had enough of a challenge to refine his single-stage rocket. In 1929, a rocket launch almost ended his career. The rocket took off with an explosion and a 20-foot column of flame that started a grass fire. Neighbors complained. The police came, the press came, and with them, Goddard's salvation. A few days later, Charles Lindbergh and Harry Guggenheim read about his rocket launch in a newspaper.
Now, who are these characters? Charles Lindbergh's the most famous human on the planet at the time because of his flight in 1927. Harry Guggenheim was also a pioneer aviator and one of the sons of the great Guggenheim fortune. He had money to burn, and Guggenheim told Lindbergh, maybe you ought to check this guy out. Well, Lindbergh went to Worcester and spent a day and an evening with Goddard and was overwhelmed. For the rest of his life, Lindbergh worshiped Goddard. He thought he was a tremendous genius who was going to raise aviation to the next level, out of the atmosphere.
Guggenheim gave Goddard money to build rockets, and Lindbergh helped him find a better launch site.
Lindbergh knew the aviation weather of North America better than anybody else, and he said, go to the southwest end of the Great Plains. There you'll find the most good weather. So at the end of the summer of 1930, Goddard and his wife and his crew and a railroad car full of their equipment show up in Roswell, New Mexico. The air is clear and dry. The altitude is about 3,700 feet. There are 360 sunny days a year. You couldn't find better conditions.
Starting from scratch, Goddard and his men constructed a state-of-the-art machine shop. And miles away from anything or anyone, a giant launch tower. After a decade of scraping by, Goddard finally had the manpower and resources he needed to really build rockets.
What set Robert Goddard apart was he was able to use both his mind and his hands. He was able to think of things, and he was able to write about them and theorize, but he was also able to build and to get people to build with him, to build a team of people.
The people that worked for him up stakes and moved 2,000 miles to what must have been a biblical wilderness to people from Massachusetts because they trusted him and they liked working for him.
Together in that wilderness, Goddard designed rockets. His loyal workers built and launched them, and Esther recorded it all. Goddard might have been earthbound, but he was in his own private paradise. For the next 10 years, Goddard and his crew would haul increasingly sophisticated rockets from their workshop to the launch pad and ignite them. He called his failures, and there were many, valuable negative information. Despite the failures, Goddard remained cheerful. He did get discouraged when Lindbergh and Guggenheim visited and a rocket failed, which happened each time they showed up. The only successful rockets Guggenheim ever saw were in Esther's footage, but he kept writing checks.
Everybody who knew Robert Goddard liked him. He had this kind of a shy, puppy-like vulnerability that attracted patrons.
But by the 1930s, Goddard's greatest achievements were behind him, largely of his own doing. He was not only suspicious of competitors, but also potential colleagues. When young scientists began setting up the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, Goddard refused to talk with them. Rocket science was his baby, and Goddard wanted to keep it that way.
He was essentially a lone wolf, and he operated unto himself. Goddard was quite secretive, and he didn't want to share his knowledge with anyone.
But his extreme altitudes paper from years before had shared his knowledge. Failing to interest the U.S. government in his work, Goddard was both jealous and alarmed to learn about rocket research in Germany, the country America had fought in World War I.
The German army got interested in rocketry as essentially a replacement for artillery and proceeded to fund quite lavishly for the time a set of researchers involved in the development of rocket technology.
The lead scientist was Wernher von Braun. After Hitler came to power, he demanded a vengeance rocket. Von Braun's team shifted into high gear in a secret facility near the town of Peenemünde. There, they designed and tested the terrifying V2. It could hit targets over 150 miles away. During World War II, V2s would terrorize London and Antwerp.
When the German V2 rockets started falling in September of 1944, the National Geographic Society, the news service, put out a story that these evil, rotten Nazis had stolen the peaceful efforts of an American professor and turned it into a fiendish weapon of war. I think Goddard always did believe it. It was not true.
Goddard could not admit the V2 was more advanced than any rocket he'd ever made. By then, his refusal to cooperate with other American scientists had pushed him to the margins. With a war to win, Goddard had sought out government work, but the only military contract he landed was far from ideal and far from Roswell. His assignment, to build rocket assists for heavy aircraft, required that he and his men relocate to a Navy base in Maryland. Goddard's wings had been clipped.
Of course, Goddard did not like the move. As soon as he got to the humidity of Maryland, it began to tell on him, on his mood and on his physical health.
As his health failed, Goddard finally recognized his isolation and began to reach out to other scientists. But on August 10, 1945, 4 days before the war's end, 62-year-old Robert Goddard died. Though Maryland's humidity had not been good for his lungs, the cigars probably did him in. He died of throat cancer. His workshop closed down, and his men dispersed. Robert Goddard never saw a rocket reach space, but his story didn't stop there. From the beginning, Goddard had tried to interest the government in a rocket program. After World War II, it suddenly paid attention. Who did America ask to guide the research? German POW, Werner von Braun. The deceased Robert Goddard would play an unexpected part. His patents and drawings were in government hands, and those hands were busy.
The federal agencies had been using his stuff and not paying any royalties, not in any way obeying the law. In 1950, the Guggenheim Foundation and Goddard's widow, Esther, filed a patent infringement claim against the United States government. What does the Army do? Declare it all top secret in the interests of national security.
But Esther Goddard had learned perseverance from the master. She refused to drop the claim.
И творческий труд создания первых искусственных спутников Земли.
Then, America's Cold War rival, the Soviet Union, launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite, in 1957. Panicked, the U.S. space program took off in a frenzy of activity. It was time to settle Esther's claim. The newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, took the lead. In 1960, it paid Esther Goddard and the Guggenheim Foundation $1 million for all of Goddard's patents. With the case settled, Goddard was free to become an American hero.
He was used politically during the Cold War era as this homegrown American rocket pioneer, and that served a very useful purpose as an icon for Americans to suggest that Werner von Braun and company were following in his footsteps, tended to help the U.S. space program, blunt any charges of picking up Nazis and so forth.
My husband would be deeply proud and happy for this very great tribute. Thank you.
Goddard's dreams would be realized. But first, America's space program had its share of failures, on a grand scale. And like Goddard, it learned from its mistakes.
Rocketry has always been a risky business, and failure is part of the process. The ultimate vindication of Robert Goddard's career came when those guys walked around on the moon for the first time.
Now step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Apollo 11 moonwalk came only some 40 years after Robert Goddard launched his first liquid fuel rocket. More recently, the Mars rover and Hubble Space Telescope have continued Goddard's original quest.
Hubble has given us now insights into what is out there. You know, it's answering questions like how old is the universe, and how large is the universe, and what happens when galaxies collide.
But the Hubble telescope can't answer the question of why we want to know, and why we keep looking towards space with longing.
What happens long term is the great question that I think a lot of people have, and whether or not we become multiplanetary. Goddard realized that this was going to take much longer than his lifetime, and that other people would have to answer a lot of questions down the road. But the beginning was what he was about.
He's a guy working as a loner, except for his assistants, on a small budget. What's amazing is how much he did get done. And in a brand new area of technology that he pioneered, he was the first.